So now we're moving forward to the next presentation that is included in our agenda. This is Luis Fernando Rosales from the Bolivian Mission in Geneva, in Switzerland. Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon. First of all, let me thank IGGG for this initiative, which I believe is very relevant and made in proper time. I would like to first show my disclaimer, though what I'm going to say is based on multilateral negotiations by Bolivia. It does not necessarily reflect my country's position in many of the different issues. This is my agenda. I will have an introduction, then I will show a short review of the multilateral debate, then the current scenario, and my conclusions. My idea in this presentation is to show the debate related to innovation, public health, and intellectual property, concrete actions, the possible solutions that countries have tried to push forward. In the past 20 years, probably this problem identified in the equation intellectual property, public health, and innovation, and access to innovation is not has not been solved. This sentence explains the problem, and it's taken from a paragraph written by the expert advisory group or expert working group. The market mechanisms and the research finance with public funds give an investment at global level that is not enough for the R&D related with diseases that are prevalent in developing countries. Many people suffer and die because there are no health technologies, medicines, vaccines, or diagnosis tools that are efficient. Markets fail because intellectual property rights are not an efficient incentive under these circumstances, and public investment is dominated by rich countries and reflect their own needs of health. Before going into the topic of before going into the historical review, I think we should talk about some urban myth. Intellectual property is not a quasi-synonym of innovation, as many people think, and rich countries have tried to transfer this idea. It is not even a determinant of innovation, and under certain circumstances, it can drown innovation. Talk about innovation in public health and intellectual property rights means a dichotomy between private interest and public health interest that I will explain along my presentation. This controversy has reached the WHO, and I will explain how it is treated. Innovation is a crucial element of economic development, but innovation is a very complex issue. It derives from the joint application of different factors: infrastructure of R&D, human capital, technology, institutional framework, public expenditure in R&D, financing, others. The Global Innovation Index published this year in Geneva talks about different criteria: human capital and research, infrastructure, market sophistication, institutions, business sophistication, knowledge and technological results, and others. The scheme of intellectual property plays a role that is almost marginal in nature. It is not a determinant. There are many other factors that are much more important. Innovation in the South, it is still a challenge. The debate in the WHO and in the WTO says that innovation and public health, as many mentioned, is innovation in health, which is a way to create a very added value economic activity. A study that I was able to read, and we should consider, is this from 2004 that shows that the pharmaceutical companies create the most revenues in developed countries. Their profitability is 18.6%, which is in the banks have a profitability of 14.5%. Another myth that we should rule out is, or discard, is that the pharmaceutical industry does not reinvest all their income in R&D, but much of their income produced by sales is used for promotion and marketing initiatives. They spend between 5 to 17% of their total income in R&D, but they spend about 30 to 35% in marketing and promotion initiatives. Some big companies spend a very little amount of their income in R&D. For instance, a giant German company in 2009 invested $1,017 million in R&D, but that represented only 3.5% of their income by sales. This is the historical review. These presentations are quite they supplement each other, all the presentations from speakers in the panel or members of the panel. So first of all, it's important to consider where the problem gets really harsh. That is when we start with the TRIPS. It's very difficult to understand these TRIPS. It's a challenge to understand that, how it came to the WTO, because WTO was about trade, global trade. And the idea was to provide certain certainties in global trade, to introduce intellectual property, reduced or deleted or eliminated that certainty. The literature says that developing countries had to pay for intellectual property and intellectual services where agriculture was included, and part of the idea here was that something I'm going to mention later in my presentation, the Doha Declaration on Public Health and Intellectual Property. This agreement sets a global framework for intellectual property that impacted on different aspects of human life: food security, information access, and the most sensitive field was the access to medicine and public health. Even though during the Uruguay round some people alerted about this, the agreement was made under this idea of the cat and the mouse, the rabbit and the carrot, actually, because developed countries offered access to agriculture and reduced tariffs to exports in order to have this included in the agreement, this idea of including intellectual property rights and services. The international community reacted against this attempt against public health, and many experts, including Carlos Correa, wrote many articles about it. The WHO member countries analyzed the effects in detail on public health, and in 1996 the 49th World Assembly adopted the resolution 49.14, stating that there should be a study on the implications of the TRIPS agreement on health. The document was published in 1996. It was called Globalization and Access to Medicine, Implication of the TRIPS Agreement from the WTO. The results were very controversial. It is known as the Red Book, and criticism from the industry was very harsh. One of the main conclusions of this Red Book was that the standards of the TRIPS agreements derived from those used in industrialized countries were not necessarily proper for the different levels of development of countries, and therefore public health concerns should be considered when such an agreement is implemented. Of course, developed countries didn't like this at all. The companies and the industry says that this led to errors, that there was other propaganda against the agreement, but the WTO continued with different projects and continued working on other resolutions.
They are now working on the program of medicine action, which deals with economic determinants and social ones that influence health, and this has had a major impact in 2011 on the summit on social determinants held in Brazil between 1999 and 2001. The pharmaceutical industry had some reactions because South Africa and Brazil tried to implement or to use the flexibilities of the TRIPS agreement to import medicine, to manufacture generics, and this created serious problems. There was pressure from civil society, international pressure stopped this. In 2001, the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health was adopted to show the willingness of developed countries, because showing that they wanted to carry out the negotiations round trade-based, looking at development. And in the long run, this wasn't development-focused anyway. In the case of the WHO, between 2001 and 2006, there are three important moments. One was the launching of the Doha round and the Doha Declaration. The second one is in 2003, the adoption of, it was decided to, the speaker corrects himself, to launch or to organize this Commission on Intellectual Property Rights, Innovation and Public Health, CIPIH, it's Resolution 6627 that convenes this commission to analyze these issues of public health, innovation and intellectual rights. They analyzed intellectual property rights, innovation and public health, taking into account the right mechanisms to fund and to create incentives for the development of new medicines and other products to be used against diseases that affect in a disproportionate way developing countries. And this approach was used by many other groups later on. What is more important here is two decisions made by, or two conclusions actually drawn. They had a list of 60 recommendations. Two key ones were, the one that says that the intellectual property system did not meet the need of developing new products to fight against diseases where the purchasing power of the market is limited or uncertain. And the second one, as a possible solution, is there is a need to have an international mechanism to increase the coordination and funding of R&D. And they also recommended starting work on the development of a treaty that would include R&D and development. As the results of the commission were not liked by a certain country in the north, this country tried to find a way of manipulate this so that the WHO would not adopt this agreement, and the best way was to create a commission, which you all know. And the acronym for this group is IGGG. So they expected developing countries not to participate too much because it's not easy to go to Geneva very frequently because of the limited resources and because of the lack of technical ability to deal with certain issues. But this was not the case for IGGG, where over 100 countries participated in the negotiations. There were many professionals from developing countries who participated, so there were highly skilled professionals participating, and we are still working with many of these professionals. The IGGG has taken up 8 elements which are well known and which I will not describe or mention. I'll just talk about the most important one, which is the one that is most important for this presentation, actually, which is the setting up of a working group to continue working or to continue analyzing the relationship between intellectual property, innovation, and public health. But before talking about that, I'd like to briefly explain why Bolivia is participating at this stage in a more thorough way. In 2005, Mr. Evo Morales was appointed president of Bolivia, and as you know, he is a very brave person who was able to recover the sovereignty of Bolivia, not only on the natural resources, but also on their foreign policies. So, starting at that time, Bolivia began to be active in very international fora in the area of health, climate change, trade, among others. An active involvement of Bolivia then in international affairs. So when the ICWI process was started, Bolivia submitted recommendations and proposals. They started working with several countries in Geneva and also in the region. Going back to what I was saying earlier on, what is most important here, and this presentation will be available for you later on, the most relevant element or the most relevant element in the IGGG process was the adoption of a global strategy and the action plan, and the most important contributions are on this slide. The idea is to promote a new way of thinking and looking at innovation and access to medicine. That is, intellectual property is not the main driver. We must look for other ways. It repeats that the current system of incentives based in the market and related to intellectual property rights does not meet the needs of the developing countries, that the price of drugs is one of the factors that influences the access to drugs and may prevent access to treatment. And the solution for this is what Claudia said, the delinking the cost of R&D from the final price of the medicines. Although the intellectual property system is flexible, there are issues in the implementation of this system in the developing countries. Another element which, considering the global strategy, it's not limited to 3 diseases, as several developing countries were calling, developed countries were calling for. They wanted us to focus just on AIDS, malaria, and TB, but other diseases affecting developing countries were eventually included. The idea was to create new mechanisms for R&D. Some of them are already underway, such as the patent pool and advanced market commitments and some awards. And the key element is the setting up of an expert group that will look at R&D. That is point 7.1a of the strategy. Another contribution of this strategy is, or it says that the theme should be analyzed every year, or every 2 years, by the Assembly to know what is being done in the area of the implementation of said strategy. And finally, another element which is part of the global strategy is the idea that there should be an international treaty to coordinate and fund R&D. There were heated discussions here, and Bolivia was very involved in them. The current scenario, well, this current scenario dates back 4 years, because I believe we are still in the same sort of framework, in the same kind of debate. And here we have 2 or 3 elements. The first one is the expert working group working on funding and coordination. The first group, which is called the EWG, these experts were selected from a list of WHO. It usually happens, and they submitted a final report in May 2010 at the 63rd Assembly, and the results were quite biased, favoring the industry. They said that the results and that the current system of intellectual property was actually good for balanced R&D, and that it wasn't totally against the diseases, or it didn't totally leave aside the diseases in developing countries. It considered that these diseases were properly dealt with. And this was a change of focus, so attention was moved away from the process, and many proposals that had been submitted by the developing countries were not considered. They all didn't analyze the proposal of the possible treaty for biomedical research because they considered it didn't meet the criteria set up for the work of that group. The process was quite biased. There were transparency accusations submitted by Dr. Alcira Lopez from Colombia, and representatives of Lancet also talked about the lobbying of the industry on the work of this group. And finally, and it was also said that the report had been leaked to the industry to receive their comments. So because of all of this, the developing countries, especially UNASUR, and I'd like to mention how important the work of UNASUR was there, because in 2010, UNASUR came up as a block, as a unit, as a theme unit, because there were documents that had been developed in South America, was a resolution, and in the statement, Ecuador makes this declaration. We consider the expert group hasn't dealt with elements which are very important for developing countries, such as the impact of IP, because and that the position which is against the mandate set up in the resolution 6121 and on the mandate of the Commission on IP. The involvement of UNASUR was very important because it multiplies the position of the countries times the number of members. Everything which is said through UNASUR is very strong in the context of multilateral negotiations. Talking about the work of the experts, which Claudia has already explained, well, it was a success story because we took control of the process as countries in the selection of the experts, the processes, and in the continuous follow-up. And the experts were complemented because of the quality of the work and the transparency. The mandate of the IGGG, well, you can read it online. And these are the main elements, the main recommendations of the CEWG. And I'm not going to read them in detail. Claudia has already described them, but I'd like to mention the binding element on R&D in health. I think that the binding tool, I think that an agreement like this one is very important to solve the problem in general terms, because there are several initiatives that appear globally. There are R&D initiatives for diseases appearing in several areas in the world, but there is one mechanism that will include a global multilateral cooperation that will govern this whole field with a political view, trying to solve things taking into account the political view and not the market view. So this is one of the main recommendations of the CEWG. We believe that it is time for the member states to start a process that will drive to a binding agreement on R&D that will meet the health needs of developing countries. This would be useful to improve the application of the worldwide strategy and the action plan on public health, innovation, and IP, and is also we need to get sustainable funding for R&D. The current process, I'm going to skip this quickly. Well, these are the sample projects Claudia mentioned. This is what is still pending to be done according to Resolution 6622, set up a global observatory for R&D, set up and submit coordination mechanisms for R&D, work on the area of tropical diseases research, but UNASUR found some issues there. Thomas Pipo talked about this because this group only looks at tropical diseases, and the funding should go to all type 2, 3, and 1 diseases. The scenario, well, the current scenario, we look at a relationship between intellectual property, technology, public health, and innovation. This continuous tension here because the trade agreements increase the tension here. There are several cases all over the world. The cases of Section 3D of India, which is being analyzed according to the internal law of the U.S. And the text says products that are not chemicals that don't contain an added value, that is, which are not substantive innovation, should not be patented. Then we have the case of new drugs for hepatitis C. We all know about this. The case of the Ebola. In the latest meeting at the WHO, it was said that the vaccine had been found 10 years ago. But as it wasn't a profitable one for the markets, the clinical trials were never carried out. And 10 years went by until people began to die. And it was only then that the international community is doing something against it. Of course, there is not, and besides, there is not enough investigation or research in the area of antibiotic resistance and in some other areas too. Finally, while the tension between innovation and public health and intellectual property is deep and it won't be overcome if the necessary actions are not taken at the multilateral level. The solutions have been defined by the experts. The next steps have to be taken by the states. In 2015 and 2016, a meeting called for Resolution 6122 should be held. It's important to negotiate a treaty for R&D to counterbalance the scenario vis-à-vis the TLCs, because public health is analyzed today from the point of view of trade, not from a point of view of public health. And I think we need something like the tobacco meeting where they have a balance between health and trade. And we should look at this in the same way when talking about medications. Whatever we do next, we need the active participation of all the member states of UNASUR, as well as the participation of some other regions from Asia and Africa. Very often they have been against the UNASUR proposals, but we should engage them and work with them. And of course, we need the engagement and participation of civil society. I apologize for my long presentation, and before finishing, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Correa and Germán Velázquez, because much of the information I have used has been taken from their work.